Welcome back. We are going to start wrapping up our look at the classical world, or at least the major empires of the classical world, by looking at the Mediterranean world and the social systems found in it. We're going to start with Persia. And in Persia, we have a culture that outlaws slavery. The government under Cyrus and Darius the Great supported this and said, no, we're going to get rid of slavery, so they get rid of it. Now, this didn't get rid of it completely, but it minimized it. It lessened it to a significant extent. And they allowed people to practice their own religion, which we don't see often in early civilizations. But this will be adopted by many other civilizations after them. And we can see how they practice freedom of religion by how the actual governments, the leaders, supported the building of new temples by funding them. This is how, if you know, the Second Temple of Jerusalem gets funded. Now, moving off of Persia, we have Greece. And in Greece, we really have two major civilizations we'll look at with Athens and Sparta. Athens and Sparta are fairly similar with how they break up their classes with freemen, medics, and slaves on the Athenian side, and then the Spartiates, Perioeci, and Helots on the Spartan side. Both these translate to roughly the same of you have citizens, you have semi-citizens or skilled workers or merchants, and then you have slaves. Now, Helots in Sparta are a little different than the normal slave in that they were conquered people that lived in that territory beforehand, but the Spartans treat them like dirt, and because of a constant threat of revolt by them, Spartans will go through and kill them as part of their training, their military training, to make sure that their numbers are lower and take out any smart helots that might lead a revolt. Now, after the classes, which are fairly similar, you have women and how they're treated in society. And there's a major difference there in that women in Athens are treated much less or treated much more poorly than women in Sparta, with women in Athens getting little to no education, having no political power, and being forced to marry at a young age of around mid-teens, 14, 15, 16, somewhere along in there. And they're being married to an older man, which means they don't have much to speak up of when you have a 10 or 15-year difference between you and your husband who's had a lot of life experience and you don't have much. Another way, not necessarily that women are undercut in this, but another unique thing to Athens that isn't really in Sparta, but is also in some other Greek civilizations or city-states, is the practice of homosexuality and bisexuality, where it's viewed as okay to be curious about that stuff and have those relationships while also maintaining a marriage or anything like that. So this is much different from what we might see in Sparta, where it's kind of frowned upon to be to experiment in that way. Now, women in Sparta are treated, we can't say much better because they are a second-class citizen. They are above or below the Helots. They're not a true citizen in that they don't get to have any say in government or anything like that. But they do get trained and educated. They are taught to stay physically fit. They are taught how to run the household, and they actually do run the household and own land. And this is all because the men go off fighting on wars so constantly that someone's got to be able to run the things, the farms and businesses back home competently. And so the women are expected to do that. And because of this, women will marry men of the same age to show they're more equal and be on equal grounds when it comes to this stuff. Now, again, they don't have any political rights, but to show their worth, the only way they can die as a good and noble citizen is through childbirth, which is in order to create more Spartans. While as Spartan men, the only way they can die a glorious death is in an actual battle. So if you don't die in either of those situations, you don't have a glorious death, and therefore you don't get a headstone when you die. But women are, as you can see, even though they might not get a glorious death as easily, or you might not want that glorious death, they are treated slightly better than women in Athens, but not as equals to men. Then the next and last society we'll look at is Rome, and we're going to look at their social classes, actual slavery in Rome, and then the patriarchal, how the patriarchal structure is set up. So, starting off, the top class is the patricians. These are the original families in Rome that were part of the Senate. They are the wealthiest families, although their wealth goes away over time, and some plebeians will rise above them. But they are the ones that run government originally, and they are the main officers in the army. Plebeians, on the other hand, are just that rank below them, and there's a vast array of plebeians. They can be the super wealthy businessmen. They can be normal soldiers. They can be the artisans, shopkeepers, just small farmers. They're whatever. They're the mix of everything else. Um, and so you have some very, very wealthy ones that will marry into patrician families, and other ones that will just kind of stay in a lower class. And they could not run for office immediately or early on. They could vote though, but then that changes, and they have some offices that they can run for, and eventually they will be able to be officers in the army, and a lot of them will actually become emperors instead of the patricians. Um, then you have the non-citizens who are all throughout the empire that don't have equal rights to the plebeians and the patricians, but they do have some rights, and they are treated fairly fairly throughout the empire. And then the lowest class is the slaves, and um, the slaves we'll talk a little bit more about in a second. But you can see down here at the bottom basic images of what they would look like, with the patricians being the one with the typical toga, plebeians wearing more of a tunic all the time, which most Romans wore anyways. They didn't wear the toga around all the time, and that was a very, very patrician or very upper class garment to wear. And then slaves being just clothed the torso down, or lower than the torso, waist down. So slaves are about 30 to 40% of the population. Most of them are POWs from the wars that Rome fights, or they're indebted, and that is how they're going to pay off their debts. They have very few rights and are treated fairly poorly, but they're expected to be treated somewhat humanely because they are human. The jobs they work are anything and everything in between, except for ones in the military. They work as servers, they work as farmers, they work as advisors to politicians, and the most famous job they have is probably the gladiators and the gladiatresses, the men and women that fought in the rings against each other for the amusement of the public. They're the most famous, and that is one way that they could gain their freedom. Other ways that they could gain it is by earning enough money and being able to buy it, or by being given it by their master. Now, because there are so many slaves in Rome, there's always a threat of rebellion, just as we saw with Sparta. And the slave rebellions come every so often, and the biggest one is the Spartacus rebellion in 73 BCE, where Spartacus leads hundreds of thousands of slaves up and down Italy for 2 years, destroying and looting everything they can. But they're eventually put down by Pompey and Crassus, and that ended the most horrific of the slave rebellions. And then the last thing with slavery is that because of how much it's used in Roman society, modern historians will look at it as that is one of the reasons why Rome falls. I don't necessarily agree with it, but it does hamper innovation a little bit, and it can lead to people not being as invested in their empire that they belong to as they might if they were actually full citizens fighting for it. So, the last thing here, the patriarchal system with women. Women were treated okay, and it depends on what class you're in. Of course, if you're in the upper class, it's going to be better than the lower classes. But women were educated, or could be educated. They could own property. They could own businesses. They could divorce their man. Also, men could divorce their woman easily. But they were mainly expected to care for the home. They didn't get any voting rights and could not hold political office. However, they could influence their husbands, and they could start rebellions. We see Julia Agrippina the younger influence her husband Claudius to put her son Nero on the throne, even though he's not related to Claudius. And we see Boudica in England rise up and create a rebellion that will shake Rome and shake Rome's control of England, but she'll be put down brutally within that year of 50 CE. Um, so women could play a role in politics, but it wasn't the through holding office or through elections or anything like that. It was indirect influence um, in it. But women were treated better here than what we see in kind of Athens, Greece, and in some other societies that we'll look at during this time period.